Good morning. Today we celebrate the feast of the baptism of the Lord. Now this feast, baptism of the Lord, is actually connected to the celebration we had last week, which is the Epiphany. Baptism is part of the Epiphany, meaning that God manifesting Himself to us. As in the Feast of the Three Kings, it was God showing Himself to the nations. Let me use some of you who called me up this week. I had about 3 or 4 telephone calls. And then in one of the telephone calls, a young kid came up and said, "Is it true, Father, that, we went to church, another church last Sunday, and they found out that one of the 3 kings is black. You don't see that in our manger, because our manger is generic. It has only one color. But in other churches, they would show you the kind and who they were. And one of them would show black. And the kid said, "My mom went back to the gospel last week, could not find the word black king." That's very true. Do you know that in that gospel there's not even a mention of 3 kings? Try it again. 2nd chapter of Matthew, verses 1 to 17. There's no mention of 3. It's almost like this is a fake news. There's no mention of 3 kings. What is mentioned, as I tried to explain that to the 7:30 and the 12 noon masses last week, is 3 gifts. So now we go back to the question of black king. Because in last week's gospel, there's a mention towards the end of the gospel, and the 3 magi went home by a different route. Now follow that home, and then you will pass by the Middle East countries. Follow that all the way to the end of that continent. That's Africa. And that will give you an idea why there is a black king in the 3 kings. See? Because the point of last week's gospel was God showing Himself to the nations. Right? To many different nations. And guys, that includes the Philippines. Africa. So now we have that, God showing Himself to the nations. Now we go into the feast of the day, the baptism. We know that baptism is to cleanse, forgive our sins. Now how come Jesus had to undergo baptism when we know Jesus has no sins? Because Jesus wants to take the sins of the people upon Himself, to cleanse them of their sins. And what are, say for instance, some of the sins that we have as human beings? Let's try to apply that quickly, the reading of the day as well as the idea of the Epiphany. The thing that we need to cleanse ourselves is that hunger and thirst for power. And that would show us sometimes that it could be destructive, source of chaos. We have seen it Wednesday. Some people do not want to let go their hunger and thirst for power. But let's go into who this Jesus is. Go back to the first reading. In the first reading, there's a mention of this servant of God would not break a reed. Are you guys familiar with the reed? I am, because close to our house, in my hometown is a pond. And my mother would bring me to the pond many times in a year. And then when you see the reed, they're so beautiful when they're under the surface of the water. But once the reed goes beyond the surface of the water, they look ugly. When they begin to break up. The point of this is that this is the servant of God who is tender, compassionate, loving, and caring. This is who Jesus is. This is the God that we should follow, not our human attitude and nature that looks for power, hunger and thirst for power, because they could be destructive. Let us try to follow this loving, caring, compassionate Jesus who doesn't want to break the reed, the beauty of the reed, the beauty of nature, the gifts given to us by God.